The group I support, and indeed most Christians in Australia, believe that giving someone who is dying, who is unrelieved suffering, the choice of voluntary assisted dying is an act of compassion. Religious and ideological opponents to the bill believe that it's an act of evil. When we look at the response here, we actually have to think, why do they think that? Because we're talking about human compassion. And human compassion is quite amazing. It extends actually beyond the human species to other species. As anyone here who has had a pet will testify. If indeed you have had pets for many years, you may, like me, have had that very painful visit to the vet. Your animal is dying. Your animal is suffering. And the vet says that suffering will only get worse. And you make the extremely painful decision amidst tears to put your animal to sleep. That response is seen universally, even among people that are opposed to VAD, universally as an act of compassion and love. Now, mentally transpose the dying animal who suffers with a dying human being who suffers. And here we see the illogic. What was seen as an act of compassion in the case of putting a dear animal out of their suffering, now on the part of people opposed religiously to VAD is seen as an act of evil, where we have a human being who is dying, who is suffering, and that suffering cannot be alleviated. And they ask, unlike your animal, they ask for that suffering to end. And suddenly what was compassion in the case of the animal is now evil in the case of the human. There is a complete and logical disconnect here. And when challenged with that logical disconnect, the religious and ideological opponents of VAD will resort to misrepresentation. They will say, for example, well, it's killing, or even worse, it's murder. Now let's get very clear about terminology. Voluntary assisted dying is not killing. The person is already dying by definition in the legislation. The only question is, what will be the manner of their dying? Will they actually be forced to die in agony and suffering, or will they be allowed to die peacefully, painlessly, surrounded by those that love them? Opponents of VAD on the religious basis will quote sometimes, the Bible says, thou shalt not kill. And they're right, the Bible does say that. A better translation from the Hebrew is indeed, thou shalt not murder. And this would have to go down as one of history's all-time great OH&S guidelines. Don't murder people. That is a great safety tip. It really is. And if more people over history had actually followed that safety guideline, we'd be a lot better off. People wouldn't have murdered other individuals. We wouldn't have murdered people in war. And I might add, if Christians over the centuries had actually followed that as a commandment rather than a guideline they can push away when convenient, Christians wouldn't have slaughtered other Christians and non-Christians in wars and slaughtered people in inquisitions. I'm all for the commandment, thou shalt not murder. But please tell me what remotely the commandment, thou shalt not murder, has to do with voluntary assisted dying. How can you possibly equate the commandment, thou shalt not murder, the commandment, the prohibition against murdering someone who does not want to be murdered, with the case of someone who is dying, someone who is an unrelieved and unrelievable suffering, who actually asks for their suffering to be ended? The misrepresentation is willful and egregious. They will sometimes quote, again trying to contrast why it's compassion with an animal, but evil when you try to end a human being suffering, they will say, well, it's different with an animal. An animal doesn't have a soul, a human being has a soul. And God owns that soul, and it's not for a human being to let go of it. Well, I say to that response, now just let me get it straight. You're telling me that I've got something that my animal, my dog, doesn't. And my dog could be put out of its misery because it doesn't have a soul, and that's an act of compassion. But because I've got a soul, I actually have to die in misery and agony. Well, as far as I'm concerned, this soul puts me at a serious disadvantage compared to my dog. Can I please hand back my soul? What about if I don't believe in soul the way you do? What about if I don't believe in soul at all? And what about this God you claim to believe in, this God who possesses my soul, who's so possessive of my soul that he insists that my life stay even though I'm in suffering and agony? What about if I don't believe in the kind of God you appear to believe in, but I instead believe in a God of mercy, love and compassion? Or what if, in this pluralistic society, I don't believe in God at all? What, in essence, the religious and ideological opponents of VAD are saying to those who want the legal option is this: if you are the person who's dying, who's in unrelieved agony and wants the choice, what the VAD opponents effectively are saying is this: look, I know you're dying and I know you're in unrelieved and unrelievable suffering, and I'm sorry about that, but what you have to understand is that if you were to end your life peacefully and painlessly through this legislation, because of what I believe, that would make me feel very uncomfortable. And because I'm very focused on my own comfort, in order to maintain my comfort, regrettably, you will need to die in agony. Human beings are endlessly self-referential. With so much we experience in life, it comes down to, what do I think? How does this affect me, me, me? What do I think about this VAD legislation? How do I feel? What do I think should happen? Are we prepared for once to step out of the centre of this debate, to take our beliefs and our fears and even our discomfort to one side and leave in the centre of this debate the person, the only person who should ever be at the centre, and that is the person who is dying and who is in unrelieved suffering? Some of you, I know, are not religious. Some of you, I suspect, may indeed be Christian though. And if you are a follower of Jesus, you might have seen that bumper sticker from time to time and thought about it. WWJD. What would Jesus do? Now, in the Gospels, there is nothing specific about what Jesus said. Voluntary assisted dying is not covered in it. But we can get a hint based on how Jesus engaged with those who suffered. In the Gospels, we read he was approached once by a leper, someone that no one would touch, someone that no one would heal. And Jesus touched him and Jesus helped him. Jesus responded with compassion, we hear. The Greek word from which we get compassion is a word related to the gut, the viscera. Jesus responded viscerally in his gut with compassion for this person. It would appear that Jesus, reading the Gospel, had few limitations when it came to healing suffering. Sadly, our modern medical science has many limitations. Sometimes someone is dying and that's all there is no healing. And sometimes the pain and suffering cannot be relieved. I wonder, would Jesus not look at someone in pain and suffering whose suffering could not be relieved? Would he not feel moved in his gut with compassion for that? I challenge you, if you are a follower of Jesus, particularly if you're a follower of Jesus who might feel uncomfortable or opposed or unsure about this legislation. I simply challenge you. What makes you think that Jesus would not be wholeheartedly in support of the choice for voluntary assisted dying? In conclusion, we are dealing in this legislation with circumstances that none of us would choose. Circumstances of unrelieved suffering. If we're lucky, those circumstances will never apply to us. If you and I are lucky, we'll live an active, healthy life to a ripe old age, and then one night in our sleep we'll just fall off the perch. If we are lucky, it won't affect us. But it does affect some people. And it is the suffering of those people, not religious sensibilities, that should be our utter focus. When someone is dying, when someone's suffering is unrelieved and unrelievable, and they want that suffering to end, must not our response as a compassionate society be to say, how can we help to end your suffering?